Amara had learned to make herself small in ways that had nothing to do with her body. It was in the angle of her shoulders when she entered a room. Never square, always slightly turned, as if perpetually in the act of leaving. It was in the way she held a wine bottle, grip firm but not possessive, like someone borrowing something that would never belong to her. It was in her breathing, shallow enough that no one would hear the rustle of air in her lungs, deep enough that she wouldn't faint during the long hours standing in heels that pinched her toes. She had 3 rules. The first, never make eye contact unless spoken to directly. The second, never correct anyone, even when they mispronounced French wine regions or ordered dishes that would clash on their palates. The third, and most important, never, ever show that you remember anything about them from one visit to the next. Rich people paid for the fantasy that their lives were too grand to be memorable, that each night out was a unique performance. Amara gave them that gift, even when she recognized the same affair unfolding across the same corner table, the same lies told over the same dessert. 3 years ago, she had been Dr. Amara Okafor, the youngest forensic toxicologist at the Federal Research Institute. She had testified in courtrooms, published papers that other scientists cited, and once spent 14 straight hours identifying a synthetic compound that had killed 6 people at a wedding in Kaduna. Her colleagues called her the Nose because she could detect trace elements in solutions that machines sometimes missed. She had been proud of that name. Now she was just Amara. No title. No past. No future that extended beyond the next rent payment. The accident, that's what she called it when she allowed herself to think about it at all, had happened in her lab. An explosion that the official report blamed on her negligence, though she had followed every protocol, checked every seal, documented every step. The pharmaceutical company whose experimental drug she had been investigating made sure the blame stuck to her skin like acid. They had better lawyers, deeper pockets, and friends in places that mattered. Within 6 months, she lost her license, her apartment, and her ability to sleep through the night without jerking awake, convinced she smelled smoke. What she didn't lose was Zena. Her niece had been 9 when Amara's sister died, cancer, aggressive and cruel. Zena was 12 now, all elbows and questions and a laugh that sounded exactly like her mother's. She was the reason Amara wore the too tight heels and smiled at men who snapped their fingers for her attention. She was the reason Amara had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight, because if the wrong people noticed her, if they realized she was still alive and might still be dangerous to their secrets, Zena would be the leverage they used. So Amara became a ghost. She worked the evening shift, 6 days a week, at the Sky Garden. She poured wine that cost more than her monthly salary. She watched powerful people make decisions that would shape the city while she cleared their plates. She went home to the small flat she shared with Zena, helped with homework, packed lunches, and pretended that this half-life was enough. Some nights, Zena asked about her old work. "Tell me about the poisons," she would say, curled up on their second-hand couch, her science textbook open across her knees. And Amara would describe the elegant deadliness of arsenic, the brutal efficiency of cyanide, the way certain compounds could stop a heart without leaving a trace. She never told Zena the full truth, that she still dreamed in chemical formulas, that her nose still cataloged every scent she encountered, that the part of her brain trained to detect death had never stopped working, even when she wished it would. Because being a ghost meant more than just hiding. It meant killing the parts of yourself that wanted to be seen, to be heard, to matter. And Amara had become very good at that particular murder. Until tonight. Until the moment she lifted a bottle of 1945 Romanicani and smelled something that didn't belong. Until her dead past and fragile present collided in the space between a wine glass and a man's lips. Kong Junesio arrived at exactly 9:15, which meant he was late by the standards of men who controlled time itself. Amara felt the shift before she saw him. A change in air pressure, like the moment before lightning strikes. The other servers straightened their spines. The sommelier adjusted his tie. Even the kitchen noise seemed to drop half a decibel, as if the building itself had taken a breath and held it. He moved through the restaurant's entrance with the careful economy of someone who knew that wasted motion was wasted power. Mid-40s, she guessed, though his face had the kind of smooth agelessness that came from expensive skincare or good genes or both. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored to shoulders that spoke of either disciplined gym time or genetics that had been kind. But it was his hands that caught her attention, scarred knuckles beneath the French cuffs, the kind of damage that came from hitting things that hit back. Two men flanked him. The one on his left was built like a wall with a face, his bulk barely contained by his black suit. The one on his right moved with a fighter's grace, his eyes constantly scanning the room, cataloging exits and threats. Park Min-jae, the head of security. Amara had served him before, had watched him taste Juniseo's food first, had seen the slight bulge under his jacket that could only be a weapon. They were shown to the Celestial Room, the restaurant's most exclusive space. A private dining area separated from the main floor by frosted glass walls that turned the rest of the world into elegant shadows. Amara had served there only 3 times in 3 years. It was reserved for people who needed their conversations to stay buried. She wasn't assigned to their table. That honor went to Marcus, the senior server who spoke 4 languages and never sweated, even during the worst dinner rushes. But Amara watched from her station near the wine cellar entrance, watched the way Juniseo settled into his chair like a king claiming a throne, watched the way his security team positioned themselves, Min-jae by the door, the other guard near the window, creating a triangle of protection. There was something about Juniseo that reminded her of the compounds she used to study. Stable on the surface, but fundamentally reactive. The kind of element that could sit peacefully in a beaker for hours, then explode the moment it encountered the wrong catalyst. He smiled at something Marcus said, and the smile was warm and genuine and absolutely terrifying, because she could see in his eyes that warmth cost him nothing. It was just another tool he had mastered. The danger around him wasn't subtle. It clung to him like expensive cologne, present, deliberate, impossible to ignore once you noticed it. She had smelled it before, in the lab, in the courthouse, in the rooms where powerful men made decisions about other people's lives. It was the scent of consequence, of actions that rippled outward and crushed things in their wake. 2 other men joined the table. One she didn't recognize, young, nervous, his designer watch too large for his wrist. New money trying to sit at an old money table. The other made her fingers tighten on the wine bottle she was holding. Lee Hyunwoo. She knew that face from the newspapers, from the background research she had done 3 years ago when she was still foolish enough to think justice could be served through official channels. He was connected to the pharmaceutical company. Not directly, not in ways that appeared on organizational charts, but in the shadowy spaces where corporate interests met criminal enterprise. She had seen his name in documents that mysteriously vanished from evidence rooms, had heard his voice on recordings that somehow became corrupted before trial. And now he sat at Kong Juso's table, laughing at something the nervous young man said, and Amara felt her carefully constructed invisibility crack just slightly. Because the past wasn't supposed to walk into her present wearing a $10,000 suit and ordering appetizers. Marcus caught her eye and gestured. They needed someone to bring out the wine Junesio had requested. A 1945 Romani Conti. One of 12 bottles left in the world. Amara's hands were steady as she retrieved it from the climate-controlled vault. Steady as she checked the vintage, confirmed the seal, placed it carefully in the presentation basket. Her hands were steady, but her pulse was not. The bottle felt heavier than it should. 79 years of fermented grapes, sealed and waiting in darkness, now cradled in her hands like a small, expensive bomb. Amara approached the celestial room with the measured pace she had perfected. Not too fast, which suggested nervousness, not too slow, which suggested reluctance. Just the smooth glide of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Marcus held the door open for her, his expression carefully neutral. Inside, the conversation paused. 4 sets of eyes tracked her movement, though Juniseo's lingered only briefly before returning to Hyunwoo, who was mid-sentence about property developments in Gangnam. Only Park Min-jae watched her with real attention, his gaze following her hands, her posture, the angle at which she held the bottle. She presented the wine first to Juneseo, label facing him, both hands supporting the bottle's base. The ritual demanded silence from her, acknowledgement from him. He glanced at it, nodded once. Permission granted. The opening was ceremony. She had practiced it until her hands could perform it while her mind wandered elsewhere. The careful cut of the foil capsule, the gentle insertion of the corkscrew, the slow, steady pull that brought the cork free with barely a whisper of sound. An old wine like this required respect. The cork could be fragile, could crumble, could ruin everything if handled with too much force or too little care. It came free intact. She placed it on the small silver tray beside Juniseo's plate, evidence of authenticity. He didn't look at it. Men like him trusted or they didn't, and checking corks was for people who still needed proof of value. She poured an ounce into his glass, the wine sliding against crystal with a sound like silk against skin. This was the moment for him to taste, to approve, to either accept or reject what she had offered. But Junisio was still listening to Hyunwoo, still nodding at whatever plans were being described, and he waved his hand in a casual gesture that meant, "Continue, I trust it, fill the glasses." Amara moved clockwise around the table. The nervous young man first. He watched the wine pour like he was watching magic, his eyes wide with the kind of wonder that money hadn't yet made boring. Then Hyunwoo, who didn't look at her at all, who kept talking about permits and zoning laws and officials who could be convinced. Then Park Min-jae, who accepted his portion with a slight nod, the only acknowledgement she would receive. Finally, back to Junesio. She leaned in, angling the bottle, and that's when it hit her. The scent rose from the glass like a ghost made of molecules. Underneath the expected notes, cherry, earth, that particular mineral quality of grape burgundy, there was something else. Something that didn't belong. Her brain catalogued it before she could stop herself, before she could remember that she was supposed to be a ghost who noticed nothing. Bitter almonds. Faint but unmistakable. And beneath that, a metallic edge that made her think of copper wire heated to burning. The combination was specific, deliberate, impossible to mistake once you had spent 6 months studying its properties in a laboratory. VX7. A designer neurotoxin. Synthetic, traceless unless you knew exactly what to look for, and deadly in amounts smaller than a grain of rice. She had helped identify it 3 years ago after it killed a whistleblower in Abuja. The pharmaceutical company had been developing it as a pesticide, or so they claimed. Amara had proven it was optimized for human targets. The same pharmaceutical company Hyunwoo worked for in the shadows. Her hand trembled. Just slightly. Just enough that the wine's surface rippled in the glass she was filling. She caught herself, steadied, completed the pour. Set the bottle down on the presentation stand with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't, couldn't, wouldn't. Junesio reached for his glass. Time did strange things. It stretched and compressed, turned elastic. She saw his fingers wrap around the crystal stem. Saw him lift it toward his lips with the casual confidence of someone who had never considered that his wine might be the last thing he tasted. Saw the dark liquid tilt toward his mouth. And Amara had perhaps 2 seconds to decide whether being invisible was worth more than being alive. Her hand moved before her mind finished the calculation. 3 years of practiced invisibility shattered in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Her fingers closed around Junesio's wrist. Not the glass, the wrist, because grabbing the glass might spill it, might splash it on his lips, might kill him anyway, and her grip was iron. "Don't drink." The words came out steady. Clear. Loud enough to stop the conversation like a knife through silk. For things happened simultaneously. Park Min-jae's hand disappeared inside his jacket. The young man's chair scraped backward. Hyunwoo's face went perfectly, carefully blank. And Junesio's eyes, dark, cold, absolutely focused, locked onto hers with the kind of attention that could dissect a person. "It's not a vintage," Amara said, still holding his wrist, still feeling his pulse under her fingers. Steady, unhurried, the pulse of someone deciding whether she would die quickly or slowly. "It's a funeral." Min-jae was beside her now, his weapon drawn but not yet pointed, his other hand reaching for her shoulder. She had perhaps 3 more seconds of consciousness before they removed her from the room, from the building, possibly from the earth itself. "Bitter almonds," she said, speaking faster now, her scientific brain overriding her survival instincts. With a copper base note. VX7 synthetic neurotoxin. Approximately 0.3 milligrams based on scent dispersion. Fatal dose is 0.2. You'd be dead before you swallowed. Junesio's expression didn't change, but his hand made a small gesture. Min-jae stopped moving. Didn't lower the gun, didn't step back, just froze in place like a paused video. "You can smell poison." Junesio's voice was soft, almost curious. The voice of someone asking about the weather, not about his own murder. "I used to identify it for a living." Amara's pulse hammered in her throat, but she kept her voice level. "Forensic toxicology. Federal Research Institute." Before, she stopped. Before didn't matter. Only now mattered, and now meant she was either saving a life or ending her own. "She's lying." Hyunwoo leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but Amara saw the tension in his jaw. "This is ridiculous. That wine is worth $30,000. It's been in your cellar for 6 months. Has it? Junesio still hadn't looked away from Amara. Min-jae, who arranged for this bottle. A pause. Hyunwoo recommended the vintage, sir. Said it would pair well with the wagyu. The silence that followed had weight. Amara could feel it pressing against her skin, could see it in the way Hyunwoo's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his napkin. The young man had gone pale, his eyes darting between faces like he was watching a tennis match where the ball was made of grenades. Put the gun to her head, Junesio said calmly, and Min-jae moved instantly, the barrel cold against Amara's temple. She didn't flinch. Couldn't afford to. Flinching meant weakness, and weakness meant death. Junesio lifted the wine glass, held it up to the light. The liquid gleamed like liquid rubies, beautiful and deadly. If you're wrong, he said to Amara, Min-jae will paint the wall with your brain. If you're right. He shifted his gaze to Hyunwoo. Well, then we have a different problem. I can prove it, Amara said. The gun barrel pressed harder against her skull, but she kept talking. Salt. Bring me table salt and watch what happens. This is insane, Hyunwoo said, but his voice had changed. Sharper now. Worried. You're going to believe some waitress over. Bring salt, Junesio interrupted, and Marcus, who had been frozen in the doorway, practically sprinted to comply. Amara's legs were shaking. Her hands were shaking. Everything was shaking except her voice, which remained steady as she said, VX, 7 reacts to sodium chloride. The neurotoxin breaks down and oxidizes. It'll turn the wine black within 30 seconds. Marcus returned with a salt shaker, set it on the table with trembling fingers, and backed away like it might explode. Junesio pushed the wine glass toward Amara. Show me. She reached for the salt, Min-jae's gun still pressed against her head, and thought, this is how scientists die. Proving theorems at gunpoint. Her hand was steady as she began to pour. The salt crystals fell into the wine like snow into blood. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. 3 seconds where Amara could hear her own breathing, could feel the cold circle of the gun barrel imprinting itself into her skin, could taste copper in her mouth though she hadn't bitten her tongue. 3 seconds where Hyunwoo's face remained carefully blank, and Junesio watched the glass with the patience of someone who had waited out interrogations and sieges, and probably executions. Then the wine began to change. It started at the surface, a darkening that spread like ink dropped into water. The deep ruby shifted to burgundy, then to something darker, something wrong. Within 10 seconds, the entire glass had turned the color of tar, black and oily and absolutely undeniable. Jesus Christ, the young man whispered, and Min-jae's gun hand twitched against Amara's skull. Junesio picked up the glass, held it to the light. The liquid was opaque now, completely transformed. He set it down with the careful precision of someone handling evidence. Then he looked at Hyunwoo. Explain. Hyunwoo's smile was practiced, smooth, the smile of someone who had talked his way out of tighter corners. I don't know what kind of trick this is, but... Min-jae. Junesio didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The gun left Amara's head. She heard the safety click off, heard Min-jae's footsteps move around the table, and when she looked up, the barrel was pointed at Hyunwoo's forehead instead. I asked you to explain, Junesio said, still in that same calm tone. The wine you recommended is poisoned. The waitress knew the specific compound. The chemistry proves her right. So explain to me why I shouldn't have Min-jae redecorate this very expensive room with the inside of your skull. Hyunwoo's hands rose slowly, palms out. The smooth smile was gone now, replaced by something harder, more calculating. You're making a mistake. That woman, do you even know who she is? I know she just saved my life. She's Amara Okafor. Disgraced toxicologist. Lost her license 3 years ago for causing a lab explosion that nearly killed 6 people. She's unstable, paranoid, probably hallucinating. The wine is black, Junesio interrupted. That's not a hallucination. Amara's mind was racing. Hyunwoo knew her name, knew her history, had probably known exactly who was serving in this restaurant, had maybe even counted on her staying silent, staying invisible, too afraid of exposure to risk speaking up. The realization made her stomach turn. She could have poisoned it herself, Hyunwoo said, and his voice had changed again, desperate now. Think about it. She serves the wine, pretends to smell something, plays the hero. Maybe she's working for the Matsuda family, or the Russians, or maybe, Junesio said softly, you just tried to kill me, and you're scrambling for a story that doesn't end with your brain matter on my shoes. The second bodyguard, the wall-shaped man who had been stationed at the door, moved to block the exit. Hyun-woo's eyes tracked the movement, and Amara saw the exact moment he understood that talking wouldn't save him. Saw his weight shift, his muscles coil, the microsecond before he lunged. He moved fast. Faster than someone in a $10,000 suit should move. His hand swept across the table, grabbing a steak knife, and he drove it toward Junseo's throat with the kind of precision that spoke of training, of practice, of previous kills. Min-jae fired. The sound was massive in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that made Amara's ears ring. Hyun-woo's shoulder exploded in a spray of red, and he spun backward, the knife clattering to the floor. He hit the frosted glass wall and slid down it, leaving a smear of crimson, his face twisted in pain and rage. Not dead yet, Juneseo observed. Min-jae has excellent trigger discipline. He could have taken your head off, but he chose the shoulder instead. Do you know why? Hyun-woo said nothing, just clutched his ruined shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Because Juneseo continued, standing now, buttoning his suit jacket with calm, deliberate movements. I need you alive long enough to tell me everything. Who sent you? Who else is involved? And most importantly, he glanced at Amara, then back to Hyun-woo. Why you destroyed Dr. Okafor's career 3 years ago. Amara's ears were still ringing from the gunshot, but her brain had shifted into a different mode. The one she thought she had buried 3 years ago. The analytical mode. The mode that saw patterns in chaos and turned violence into data. VX7 is a cholinesterase inhibitor, she heard herself say, her voice cutting through the shock settling over the room like fog. It blocks the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine in your nervous system. Without that enzyme, your nerves fire continuously. Muscles lock. Lungs stop. Heart fails. Death occurs within 2 to 4 minutes of ingestion. Juneseo turned to look at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Interest, maybe. Or recognition of something familiar. The way a predator recognizes another predator, even when one is disguised as prey. The compound was developed by Meridian Pharmaceuticals, she continued, surprised by how steady her voice remained while Hyun-woo bled onto the marble floor. Officially as an agricultural pesticide. Unofficially as something else. I identified it 3 years ago in the body of a regulatory inspector who was about to testify against them. And they blamed you for his death, Juneseo said. It wasn't a question. They blamed me for the explosion that destroyed the evidence. Made it look like I had mishandled volatile compounds, caused a lab fire that contaminated the samples. By the time the smoke cleared, the inspector's body had been cremated for safety reasons. My findings were dismissed as the work of a careless researcher, and I lost everything. Hyun-woo laughed, a wet, pained sound. You can't prove any of that. No, Amara agreed. But I can prove what's in that wine glass. She turned to Juneseo. The sodium chloride reaction is just the visible test. If you have access to a gas chromatograph or even a basic chemistry set, I can show you the exact molecular breakdown. The compound has a specific signature, a modified organophosphate structure with a proprietary binding agent that Meridian developed and patented. Why would we patent a poison? Hyun-woo spat. Because you're greedy, Amara said simply. You wanted to protect your intellectual property even for your illegal products. It's in the patent filing from 2019, buried in technical language about novel pest control applications. I read the whole thing. Memorized it, actually, because I thought someday I might need to prove what you did. The young man, she had almost forgotten he was there, spoke up, his voice shaking. Mr. Kong, I swear I didn't know anything about this. Hyun-woo told me this was just a business dinner, I thought. Be quiet, Juneseo said, not unkindly, and the young man's mouth snapped shut. Min-jae had pulled out his phone, was speaking rapidly in Korean. Amara caught a few words, doctor, testing, laboratory, and understood that Juneseo was already moving pieces on a board she couldn't fully see. How did you know it was VX7 specifically? Juneseo asked her. There must be hundreds of compounds that could kill me. Why that one? The smell, Amara said. VX7 has a unique scent profile because of the binding agent. Most synthetic neurotoxins are odorless, but Meridian's version uses a copper-based stabilizer that gives it that metallic note. Combined with the bitter almond scent from the cyanide precursor they use in synthesis. She stopped, realizing she was falling into lecture mode. I've smelled it before. Once you've identified a scent at the molecular level, your brain files it away. Mine never deleted the file. Even after 3 years of pouring wine, Junesio observed. Even then. Hyunwoo was pale now, his blood pooling beneath him, his breathing shallow. You don't understand what you're interfering with, he said to Junesio. Meridian has reach. They have people in every government agency, every major corporation. You kill me, they'll come for you. They'll come for everyone you care about. Let them come, Junesio said. He looked at Amara again, and this time she saw something else in his eyes. Calculation. The wheels turning behind his calm exterior. Dr. Okafor. You said you can prove the molecular structure. You said you memorized the patent. What else do you remember about Meridian's operations? Everything, Amara said, and realized as she said it that it was true. I remember everything. Junesio walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and stared out at the city sprawled 40 stories below. The lights stretched to the horizon like a blanket of stars turned upside down. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, thoughtful. 3 months ago, someone tried to kill my younger brother. Car bomb in Seoul. He survived, but barely. We assumed it was the Matsuda family. We've been fighting over shipping contracts in Busan. But the explosive compound was unusual. Too sophisticated for Yakuza work. He turned back to face the room. Min-jae, what did the forensic report say about the chemical signature? Min-jae holstered his weapon, pulled out his phone, scrolled. Proprietary explosive. The lab couldn't identify the manufacturer. They said it was unlike anything in their database. Because it wasn't in any official database, Amara said, pieces clicking together in her mind with the satisfying precision of a solved equation. Meridian doesn't just make neurotoxins. They developed a whole portfolio of chemical weapons disguised as industrial products. Explosives marketed as mining charges. Incendiaries sold as agricultural burn compounds. I saw the inventory list before the lab fire. Before they buried it. Junesio's eyes narrowed. You're saying Meridian tried to kill my brother. I'm saying someone used Meridian's products to try to kill your brother. Which means someone with access to their restricted inventory. Someone with authorization to requisition military-grade compounds. She looked at Hyunwoo, who had gone very still despite his wound. Someone like a senior operations coordinator. I'm just a consultant, Hyunwoo said through gritted teeth. I don't have access to. You arranged 13 separate shipments of VX. 7 to West Africa between 2020 and 2022, Amara interrupted. I saw your signature on the export documents. You classified them as pesticides to get past customs, but the quantities were wrong. Too large for agricultural use, too carefully distributed across conflict zones. You were selling to warlords and calling it business development. The young man made a small, strangled sound. His chair scraped as he stood, backing toward the door, but the wall-shaped bodyguard put a hand on his shoulder and pressed him back down. Junesio returned to the table, sat down in his chair with the same deliberate calm he had shown all evening. Explain to me why Meridian Pharmaceuticals would want my family dead. Your shipping empire, Amara said, the connections forming faster now. You control half the port traffic in East Asia. Meridian needs those ports for their illegal operations. They've been trying to expand their chemical weapons distribution into Asian markets, but they can't do it without reliable shipping channels. Channels that don't ask questions about cargo classifications. I don't work with drug dealers, Junesio said flatly. Exactly. You have standards, which makes you an obstacle. They probably approached you first, offered you a partnership, maybe dressed it up as a legitimate pharmaceutical distribution contract. When you refused, they decided to remove me and deal with whoever inherited the business, Junesio finished. Someone more flexible in their ethics. Min-jae spoke up. Your cousin Jinho has been pushing for expansion into gray market contracts. He argued about it at the last board meeting. Jinho. Junesio's voice went cold. Who introduced me to Hyunwoo 6 months ago. Who suggested this dinner tonight. Who specifically requested that we use the private room, away from witnesses. The pieces were falling into place for everyone now. Amara could see it in the way Min-jae's hand drifted back toward his weapon, in the way the young man's face had gone from pale to green. It's bigger than you think, Hyunwoo said, and despite the pain he must have been feeling, despite the blood loss, he smiled. Meridian has partnerships with half the pharmaceutical companies in the world. They have contracts with governments, with militaries. You think killing me solves anything? You think exposing one attempted assassination matters? No, Junesio said. But it's a start. He looked at Amara. You said you remember everything. How much of Meridian's structure do you know? Names, locations, distribution networks? Enough to bury them, Amara said. If I had the resources. If I had protection. If I had any reason to believe that coming forward wouldn't just get me killed like the last 3 people who tried. What if you had all 3? Amara met his eyes. Saw the offer there, unspoken but clear. The next 6 weeks moved like a controlled demolition, carefully planned, precisely executed, and absolutely devastating to everything in its path. Junesio's organization, Amara learned, was not what she had assumed. Yes, there were shipping contracts and port operations and warehouses full of legitimate cargo. But beneath that surface ran something else entirely. A network of information brokers, security specialists, and what Junesio called problem solvers. People who knew how to find things that were meant to stay hidden. People who understood that sometimes justice required working outside the lines that justice itself had drawn. Amara spent the first week in a safe house in Acadia, a luxury apartment that Minjae assured her was completely secure, which meant guards at every entrance and cameras covering every angle. She wrote everything she remembered. Every name, every compound, every shipment route and falsified document and buried body. Her hand cramped after the first 12 hours, but she kept writing, because this was the testimony she should have given 3 years ago, and she wouldn't waste the second chance. Xena came on the 3rd day, escorted by 2 of Junzio's people who looked more like college professors than bodyguards. Her niece ran into the apartment and wrapped her arms around Amara's waist. And for the first time since the night in the restaurant, Amara allowed herself to cry. "Are we in trouble?" Xena asked, her voice muffled against Amara's shirt. "No, baby. We're getting out of trouble." Junesio visited once, bringing a team of lawyers who recorded her statement with the kind of meticulous attention usually reserved for surgical procedures. He sat in the corner of the room, listening, his expression unreadable. When she described the lab explosion, the way the fire had consumed 3 years of research in under 10 minutes, he leaned forward slightly. "The accelerant pattern," he said. "You mentioned it was inconsistent with accidental ignition." "Yes. The fire started in 3 separate locations simultaneously. That's not how lab accidents happen. But the official investigation concluded I had stored incompatible compounds too close together, and the investigator who signed that report," one of the lawyers interrupted, checking his tablet, was Chief Inspector Emmanuel Okonkwo, who retired 6 months later and now lives in a house worth 3 times his government salary. "Meridian bought him," Amara said. "It wasn't a question." "Meridian bought a lot of people," Junesio said. "We're in the process of unbought them." The evidence arrived like an avalanche. Junesio's people had access to resources that made Amara's head spin. They hacked Meridian's servers and pulled 5 years of internal communications. They traced financial transactions through shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Singapore. They found the original lab samples from the inspector's autopsy, samples that had been marked for destruction but somehow ended up in a private storage facility in Abuja, preserved and labeled and waiting. They found the man who had planted the accelerant in Amara's lab. He was working as a security consultant in Johannesburg, living well on Meridian money. It took Minjae's team 3 days to persuade him to confess. Amara didn't ask what methods they used. Some questions were better left unasked. By week 4, they had enough evidence to file criminal charges in 3 countries. By week 5, 2 Meridian executives had fled to countries without extradition treaties, and 3 others had turned state's witness in exchange for lighter sentences. The pharmaceutical giant's stock price dropped 40% in a single trading day. Junesio's cousin Jinho disappeared. No body was found, and no one asked too many questions. Some problems, Amara understood, were solved quietly. On day 42, Amara stood in a government office in Abuja while a bureaucrat stamped documents that restored her professional license. The Federal Research Institute issued a formal apology. The chief inspector who had falsified her case was arrested. And the lead prosecutor handling the Meridian investigation asked if Dr. Okafor would be willing to serve as an expert witness in the upcoming trials. She said yes. That evening, Junesio took her to dinner, a small restaurant in Victoria Island, nothing like the Sky Garden. No wine service. No pretense. Just 2 people eating jollof rice and discussing the future. "I have a proposition," he said. Amara smiled. "I figured you might." The laboratory occupied the entire 15th floor of a building in Ikoyi that didn't appear on any public registries. The equipment was the kind Amara had dreamed about during her university days. Gas chromatographs that could detect compounds at parts per trillion, mass spectrometers that cost more than most houses, fume hoods with filtration systems so advanced they could probably make nerve gas smell like fresh flowers. But it was the sign on the door that made her stop and stare. Dr. Amara Okafor, Director of Chemical Threat Analysis. Too much. Jun Iseo asked from behind her. It's perfect, she said, and meant it. The team he had assembled was small but exceptional. 2 chemists from the University of Lagos, both young and hungry for meaningful work. A former military specialist in explosive compounds who had grown tired of building bombs and wanted to learn how to detect them instead. And Marcus, the senior server from the Sky Garden, who turned out to have a degree in biochemistry that he had never been able to use because restaurants paid better than research grants. We're not just analyzing threats, Jun Iseo had explained during her first briefing. We're building a database. Every compound that could be weaponized, every chemical signature that doesn't belong in food or wine or the air people breathe. When the next assassination attempt happens, and it will, we'll know what we're looking for before the target even takes their first sip. It wasn't traditional forensics. It was prevention, protection, the kind of work that saved lives instead of just documenting deaths. Amara spent her mornings training her team, teaching them the subtle art of olfactory analysis. Your nose knows things before your brain does, she told them. Trust it. A scent that doesn't belong is your first warning that chemistry has gone wrong. Her afternoons were dedicated to building the database. She started with compounds she knew intimately. The neurotoxins, the slow-acting poisons, the designer drugs that killed without leaving traces. Then she expanded, reaching out to contacts in laboratories across West Africa, in Europe, in Asia. Scientists who had seen things that troubled them. Researchers who had suspicions but no proof. People who, like her, had been silenced but never stopped knowing. The network grew. By the end of the 3rd month, they had documented over 200 compounds that existed in the gray space between legal chemistry and chemical warfare. By the 6th month, government agencies were quietly requesting access to the database. By the 9th month, 3 attempted poisonings had been prevented because someone recognized a scent profile that matched Amara's records. Zena visited the lab after school most days, doing her homework at one of the workstations while Amara analyzed samples. Sometimes she asked questions about the chemistry, and Amara would explain the elegant mathematics of molecular bonds, the way atoms arrange themselves into structures that could heal or harm depending on a single misplaced electron. Mom would be proud of you, Zena said one afternoon, looking up from her biology textbook. Amara's hands stilled over the sample she was preparing. You think so? You're doing what you always wanted. Protecting people. Using your brain for good things. Zena smiled, and it was her mother's smile, warm and knowing. Plus, you're not invisible anymore. No, she wasn't invisible. When she walked into meetings now, people stood. When she testified in court, judges listened. When she published her findings, they appeared in journals that mattered, under her real name, with her credentials restored and her reputation rebuilt from the ashes Meridian had tried to scatter. Jun Iseo stopped by once a week, always with new cases, new threats, new puzzles that needed her particular expertise. They had developed an easy partnership, his resources and her knowledge, his networks and her science. He never asked her to do anything illegal, though the line between legal and necessary sometimes blurred in ways that would have troubled her 3 years ago. But 3 years ago, she had believed that following every rule would keep her safe. Now she understood that safety came from being too valuable to destroy, too connected to silence, too dangerous to ignore. The evening sun slanted through the lab windows, turning the glass beakers into prisms that scattered rainbow light across the workbenches. Amara stood at her station, running analysis on a wine sample from an embassy dinner scheduled for next week, her nose cataloging each molecule, her brain filing each scent into its proper category. Clean. Pure. Safe. She initialed the report, added it to the clearance file, and moved on to the next sample. Death still had a scent. But now so did protection. And Amara Okafor had finally learned to recognize the difference.